During the pandemic, we've heard a good deal about classroom versus remote education, but there's also a place for education outdoors. If that allows for in-person learning with more distancing and fresh air, it still gives students a chance to learn about science through hands-on exploration. To tell us about those efforts over the years and even more recently, our guests from a learning partner with 8 public schools in Boston, we'd like to welcome the Executive Director of CitySprouts, Jane Hirschi, and the Program Director, Solomon Montagno. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Oh,
Thank you.
Jane, I want to start with you because one of the things you might have thought about a few times already is how the pandemic highlights the importance of a program like this. What does that mean exactly?
Well, children learning outdoors and having access to nature and science literacy at a very young age, of course, has always been there. That's not a new need. But the pandemic has really highlighted that. You know, I think first of all because outdoor learning is so much safer right now than indoor learning. But I would say there's something else too, which is an awareness about science literacy and making sure that we're raising all of our children with awareness of environmental issues, being able to think critically, and all of those things are embedded in science education and inquiry-based learning, like as is what happens in an outdoor learning garden.
Solomon, the first thing that comes to my mind here is maybe a garden outside of school. You know, you could think of it either as agriculture or landscaping, but what does that mean in terms of environmental issues?
Well, first of all, the gardens at the school help expose kids to what like a natural green space might be. A lot of our urban youth don't have that exposure, so it's hard for them to feel comfortable in those spaces. So one, they get that natural exposure to the environment, which hopefully we think they helps them create environmental stewards. Also, when we bring them out into the garden, it's that hands-on science aspect that they might not get in the classroom. So they're able to touch things, they're able to feel things, smell, use all of their senses. For example, if you're studying plants, you know, and you have a garden next to the school, why not go out into the garden and actually look at those plants in real life versus a textbook?
What about the ability to engage students? Because I'm thinking here, you put some seeds in a certain container, even if it's just a part of the ground. You're curious, you come back next week and you see if there's anything changed. I mean, why is that so effective as far as a teaching tool?
Because it really inspires that natural wonder that all of our kids have. And I think when they're outside, you know, they're surrounded by the garden. They're surrounded by natural things. You can hear the birds chirping. You can see bugs in the garden they've never seen before in their lives. So it really just captivates their imagination, which drives their learning. When kids are engaged, they want to learn, versus when they're not engaged, it feels like a task for them.
Coming back to Jane, because I'm a baby boomer, I'm more of a free range kid, at least when I was growing up, because, you know, there was at least one parent in the house. You could run around and go wherever you want. We had a woods near where we lived, and we had a lot of fun with that. But for kids growing up today, they can't do that. So I guess you're filling a need here that I didn't have to worry about.
That is so true, Chris, and that's true for me too. You know, we think a lot about what CitySprouts means for city kids, or for kids who don't have a place where they can just go dig something up. There may be soccer fields nearby and parks nearby, but you're not supposed to dig those up. You know, in the way of, you know, making forts and making dams in the creek behind your house, or even just exploring outdoors in the city, as I think you know, people, baby boomers did. So this connection to nature and getting kids access to nature, both as a place to learn and more broadly as a place to explore and build a relationship, is really a need for every child. We focus a lot on kids and children who aren't getting those opportunities. Ironically, some children are only getting those opportunities through school and through the schoolyard learning garden. But of course, I don't want to, you know, give the sense that it's not something that every child needs, regardless of their background or resources.
Solomon, what about as a tool to engage parents more indirectly? Because a lot of us, myself included, going back at least a couple of generations, we had farmers in our family. Does that mean anything too?
Definitely. We have a lot of students whose families are immigrants. And when they come to the garden and they see plants from their homeland, they feel even more connected to the school community. So it's a way for us to actually engage the cultural heritage of our youth at the same time. Parents often stop by the school to pick up their kids, but then see the garden, wander into the garden, might have one of our garden educators working in the garden and then ask them questions and actually learn more about what's going on in the garden, but also what they're learning in the classroom, what they're learning about science. So I find that one, is an educational tool, but it's also a way to build community in our schools.
Jay, what about how the students learn about food in an environmental context? Because in my neighborhood here in the city, environmental context means be careful about planting those tomatoes in the ground because there might be some lead there. What other things might students be learning?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you framed it in an environmental context. You know, there are other groups, really important groups that are working really more directly around food and healthy food. And of course, that's part of the environment. But city stuff is also about the soil, you know, the health of the soil and the air. And you know, Solomon said, just allowing children to wonder and explore what they're curious about. And I would say a lot of kids are really curious about how food grows. You know, that's an entry, that's a gateway plant for children at a very young age to see a plant that they can not only touch and smell, but also taste. So we think of our garden, the edible part of our gardens, as really a way to introduce a full environmental experience for children. And you know, healthy food is a part of it. But at City Sprouts, we've got a bigger, more environmental umbrella that we're opening for kids.
Solomon, what one difference between what you do and ordinary classroom learning is that, you know, in the latter, students are at least more stationary, outdoors, there's more movement, maybe some more interaction among the students and with some of the adults involved too. What about that social chemistry?
Well, part of it is that some kids struggle to learn in the classroom because it's hard for them to sit still. And they might even get in trouble because they are kind of moving around or need that movement break. So when they're out in the classroom, they can engage with their body, which allows them to actually focus more. Also, some students might be hands-on learners, so they're not going to be able to read or see something on the whiteboard in the classroom. They need physical interaction. So those two types of learners are just a few who we have in the garden. But because of that, they're actually able to excel and engage with their peers and talk about phenomenon that they wouldn't have normally been able to talk about. So the garden is a place for science instruction, but it's also where we can lower the barriers to learning in general.
Well, you know, any kid who spends at least 6 hours a day in a school building is glad to get out for 10 minutes of recess. That's never changed. But what about with the pandemic now? Do you see any change in how much these students are really just so glad to be outdoors?
Yeah, we have had some in-person classes here in our Cambridge partners, and honestly, being outside, sometimes it's hard to focus, you know, because the kids just haven't had that experience of being outside with their friends. You're either inside and you're with your family, or you're in school where you're 6 feet apart wearing a mask the whole time. So when they're outside, it's like almost like giddy to be outside. It no longer becomes, you know, I'm in school, but, you know, I'm exploring this forest that I'm in. I'm exploring this garden, this new world that I haven't seen in such a long time. And I'm doing it with my friends.
Jane, another dimension here is about animals. I remember coming across a passage in Thoreau where he was struck by the fact that the great oak forests were spreading around only because of the work of squirrels. What are the students learning?
Oh my gosh, you know, I think that it's eye-opening for adults as well as for children to just start to learn the breadth and the depth of animal life in our world. You know, squirrels and mammals, but also insects. You know, thinking about the amazing universe of life that's underneath the soil. You know, it's really phenomenal that the garden is outdoors, but the garden in particular is really a dynamic system that really blends and weaves both the flora and the fauna in a way that I think can engage children who know a lot and children who are just beginning that journey. Chris, I just want to say something about this pivot that CitySprouts has been making in the pandemic to remote learning. And I do want to say that we're very actively doing remote learning in Boston public schools. Solomon mentioned Cambridge public schools. But our garden educators are working closely with lots of teachers. Solomon can give more detail on that, on making sure that kids still feel connected to that garden, that they're seeing videos of their garden educator in the garden, talking about what they're finding there, and really trying to keep that relationship alive for when children can come back, and keep them wondering, while they're at home and looking at this remotely.
Solomon, do you see anything that could be a sort of an afterlife of that adjustment, even when the pandemic is over?
Definitely. One of the things we did this past summer is send home STEM kits for any of our programs that we were running, especially our after-school programs. We think that is a great way, even when the pandemic is over, to continue to engage youth outside of our CitySprouts programs. These STEM kits allowed kids to set up their own home gardens, allowed them to do different engineering activities that normally they would have been able to do at our program, but now it can also be done at home. So that's one way. And I also just think that with our remote program, our remote instruction, Jane talked about creating these videos for students and for teachers. That's another major way that we're making an impact on these youth's lives. And especially with a curriculum that we have called Early Start in Science that actually lines up with the BPS district and state science standards. So we're able to go into classrooms and tell teachers anything that we partner with you on is actually helping you further your youth science instructions, following what the district and what the state wants them to learn.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
There was Jane Hirschi and Solomon Montagno from CitySprouts.